Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Froling, President of the League of Women Voters Rochester, and I want to thank you for joining us this evening to learn more about redistricting. Our moderator tonight will be Ray Schmitz, a longtime member of the Rochester community, a longtime member of the League of Women Voters, and served our community for many years as the Olmsted County attorney. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ray Schmitz.
Good evening. Welcome. On behalf of the League of Women Voters, I'm Ray Schmitz, and I will be your moderator. This program is being recorded and will be available later on the League of Women Voters site. Your camera and microphone are muted. Your mic will remain so, but please turn on your camera. Please ask questions on the chat room. They will be screened and I will ask a sample at the end of the presentations. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization devoted to public education. Redistricting reform is a core issue identified for advocacy by the League of Women Voters Minnesota. This program will explain the process of redistricting, what should be considered when these boundaries are redrawn from the 2020 census results, and ways you can take action. The completion of the census creates a once in 10-year opportunity to realign state, local, and federal districts based on population changes. Since the last census in 2010, the population of Olmsted County has grown about 10%. The growth has been greater in some areas, while others have not grown or lost population. After each census, state and local governments need to adjust their representative boundaries to assure equal representation. County commissioners and city council ward boundaries also need to change. The League will have another meeting on redistricting and how you can be involved later this year. The League of Women Voters believes that this process should involve us, the voters, as well as government officials. We will hear from presenters. Paul Huffman, who has been the League of Women Voters Minnesota Redistricting Coordinator since June of 2019. He provides resource tools and information for local League of Women Voters chapter and members to assist them in census and redistricting efforts. And Phil Wheeler, who began working at the planning department in 1976. He became the director of the Rochester Olmsted County Planning Department in 1919 and 1990. Phil, I didn't know you were that old, until his retirement in 2013. He oversaw the redistricting of the city of Rochester and Olmsted County 5 times. Just a reminder, we welcome questions for the speakers, but the only way to ask them will be through Zoom chat. Use the chat icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen to open the chat box. We will also have some League information posted there. Paul, you're up.
All right, thanks, Ray, very much for the introduction. As Ray mentioned, I'm Paul Huffman. I'm yeah, and if you would let me share my screen, please. Yeah, whoever's sharing needs to stop sharing their screen, please. Yeah, but as we're getting that sorted out, yeah, I'm the redistricting coordinator for League of Women Voters Minnesota, and I really appreciate this opportunity to speak to the League of Women Voters of Rochester and the other folks from the community that are here. Yeah, just I will share my slides here momentarily.
Sorry, I am not able to see who is sharing that screen. And I'm not able to see how I can shut it off. So I'm going to.
At the top, there's the view options. It looks like Joan Schlegel's screen is being shared.
Okay.
If we could.
So actually, if you just go down to screen share.
Yep.
And then it should pop up a message that's there you go.
All right, great.
Sorry about that, Paul.
No problem. The wonderful world of technology. All right, so this presentation is about redistricting Minnesota. This is part of our League of Women Voters Minnesota People Power Fair Maps campaign, and really it's about how redistricting affects your voting power in Rochester and in your community in Olmsted County. What I really want to get through tonight is to talk about what is redistricting and why is it important? Why should you care? Because a lot of folks have not heard much about redistricting, and I frankly 5 or 6 years ago I was not myself very aware of redistricting and what it was and why it mattered. The second thing is to learn more about what the requirements are for redistricting. And then what our current environment is also in Rochester as well in Minnesota. And then finally, how you can learn more and take action, because this really comes into helping people understand what it is, why it's important, how can I do more. As we start, I want to emphasize that League of Women Voters Minnesota is a nonpartisan organization. We don't support either specific candidates on either side or political parties in any level of government. We're always working on issues of vital interest to the members and the public. And so while we may align in our policy interests with one party or another, we have established accountability for all parties when they are taking actions we think is inconsistent with our mission of empowering voters and supporting democracy. And redistricting and gerrymandering is something that both parties have been guilty of in the past and has the potential for the future. And our view is that the more that our communities and our citizens are aware and engaged and participating in this process, the stronger and more representative our government becomes. What I want to start with is a timeline of what's going to happen. And one of the things that's key is the census, and then how that impacts this whole cycle, and then what's in our state and federal laws of what's required. I think we're all aware that the census has been delayed due to COVID and due to data issues. Data issues are not anything new. Typically, by law, the census is required to be presented to the president by the end of December, with the apportionment data, that being how many representatives each state get in Congress. And then around the 1st of April, 3 months later, is normally when the what's called census block data is provided to the state so they can complete redistricting on a legislative and congressional district level. That's all been delayed primarily due to COVID. And so the dates right now, the estimate is late April for apportionment data to the president. As I said, that's the data that will allow each state to know how many representatives they have. That is when we in Minnesota will find out if we have 8 representatives in Congress or 7. And we're really on the bubble with that. And we did very well in the census on self-response. We had the best self-response in the country by several percentage points. But we just got to wait and see how the numbers come in. The bolded underlined items here are the opportunities for engagement in various parts of the redistricting process. And so that's why we want to start early with educating, engaging the public, mobilizing communities to understand how their government works for them, where the redistricting may impact them, and then be ready to provide inputs at those points. So the first opportunity is right now during the legislative session. The legislature, both the House and the Senate, have redistricting committees. The Senate has had a couple of committee meetings already on the background and history of redistricting. The House is preparing to have hearings on that. I spoke to Representative Murphy, who's the chair, a couple of days ago. So they're in the preparation for that process. This is an opportunity to have input to the legislature on what rules, criteria, process is used for doing redistricting. There is a bill right now in the House There will be another bill introduced through an alliance that we're a part of to the House and the Senate, proposing a revised structure for redistricting. Given the divided nature of the Senate and COVID and other issues, it's really challenging whether we're going to get that through, but it's important to keep a highlight on changing the existing system for redistricting in Minnesota. And I'll talk about the why of that here in a few moments. So this is the opportunity to engage the legislature and your local legislators. And even if they aren't on the redistricting committee, they can still have input to that committee. And in the Senate, the legislative aspects will be heard through the Senate Finance and Elections Committee. And so they can have input through that committee. So I suggest, having those connections and making those inputs. Currently, the census block data, which is the data required to do the redistricting at a state level, is expected by the end of September. As most of you know, or you may not know, is those dates have slipped several times here over the last month. The indications I have, based on talking to national organizations and hearing census leaders talk on various conferences and calls, that's a relatively good date. Now, it's late for us because our Constitution of Minnesota says that the legislature will do redistricting in the next session after the census enumeration, the exact words. And since we haven't got the block data, we haven't got the apportionment data, the enumeration isn't done yet. So that puts us in a bind with having that done and then elections in 2022. So that'll be something I'll talk through here momentarily. At some point after the block data, we expect the legislature is going to have hearings. That could be this fall. It could be in January, February. So that's really up in the air right now, but that's something also to be aware of and tuned to and be ready. Be ready to have inputs to the legislative committees when they do hearings for maps, so you make your voices known, and it's for everyone to do. Then approximately end of August, what we expect is there will be a special redistricting panel convened by the Supreme Court. In the last three redistricting cycles, 1990, 2000, 2010, there have been lawsuits filed at or around the time that the apportionment data is received, saying that since the districts are out of alignment on population, then our maps are unconstitutional, and then it's challenging, they need to be changed. The courts will hold that in abeyance. They will not take action until the legislature's had an opportunity to act in their role under the Constitution and state law. Because of the time frame, we don't think there's going to be time for the court, especially given divided legislature and the fact that the history is that split government in Minnesota does not align on a set of maps, that the Supreme Court will, around the 1st of September, establish a special redistricting panel in order to start gathering information, taking inputs on what the maps ought to be. That panel will have hearings in the fall of this year. Again, an opportunity for communities and groups and citizens to have inputs prepared, ready to make to that forum to argue for what the maps ought to look like in Minnesota. And then in the fall, there should be and could be, doesn't have to be, hearings and meetings at the county and city level on how local redistricting will take place. So that's another opportunity in the city of Rochester and in Olmsted County to make your desires and interests known to legislators in a specific manner through public hearing on things such as public hearings for redistricting, criteria for redistricting. There are counties that established criteria in 2011 for how they did redistricting. And there's no reason that Olmsted County can't do the same. That will then lead the special redistricting panel to a court order on February 15th, 2022, almost exactly a year from now. And that's a pretty hard date because by statute in Minnesota, legislative maps are supposed to be redrawn by that date for this year in the even numbered year, 25 weeks before the primary elections. That gives time for candidates to file, ballots to be printed, and the process of the elected officials and candidates to take place to have an orderly conduct of elections. So I think, and in the last two cycles, 2002 and 2012, that equivalent date is when the Supreme Court issued their map orders. So I think that's a pretty good date. You can put that in your calendar, circle in red, that I would think that that's when we'll know what our legislative and congressional maps are going to be. That then kicks off the formal process of the local redistricting for cities and counties. City redistricting has to be done 60 days after the drawing of the legislative maps. And then counties and other districts, for example, some school boards, have to be done in 80 days. So that's the timeline. Now, some of those dates are pretty far out, but part of what I'm reinforcing is that to be ready to engage at those times, to be ready if those happen earlier, then we need to start working now to get people engaged and educated. Before I move forward, just see if there's any specific questions on the timeline. And we will take questions at the end and we can go to that. So then what is redistricting? And probably some people here haven't heard of this. I talked about apportionment. That's a federal action under the Constitution where the number of representatives for each state is determined based on population. Redistricting is what states do. That is a state role on drawing the lines for congressional and legislative maps. And that's how the states do that varies. Every state determines its own process. And at the same time, there is local redistricting that gets done. And that's the responsibility of local governments, cities and counties. And the city and county officials are the ones who do that. Some legal basis, the Constitution is what talks about apportioning of seats. And that ties directly to the census and being based on each person in the country. And so the maps for Congress are based on each person in the country. And the way that legislative maps have been done historically is based on the number of persons in the country. For Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929, what lots of people don't know is Congress decided not to do reapportionment and redistricting in 1920. If you think about, it's highly political as a process. As population moves, as changes, power shifts. And we talk about Minnesota potentially losing a district, Texas, Montana, Florida, likely gain districts because that's where population is moving. You think about what's happening in the early part of the 20th century with a lot of immigration, a lot of migration from rural areas to cities. Had Congress reapportioned in 1920, they were seeing a significant shift of representation to the west, to the east, and away from some of the center of the country, which is similar to what we talk about today even. So that anchored that in law in 1929. And so that has been the base law that has driven since that time how and when we do redistricting. There's a court case. There were a number of Supreme Court cases in the early 60s that talked about redistricting. And I'll talk about some of the dysfunction that happened up until the 1960s on redistricting. But the Supreme Court weighed in, and this was a dramatic shift for them. Until the 1960s, the Supreme Court position had been that redistricting is a political process and it was somewhere where the courts didn't belong. But similar to the argument about partisan gerrymandering today, there came a point where the Supreme Court became probably a little more progressive and more activist. And they said there's a point at which they had to act. And this is where you get the one person, one vote, so that you cannot failed to balance population. And so this is where the balancing population in districts comes from. And finally, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act really says that you can't block draw district lines in a way that would not enable minorities to have adequate representation. And that goes for any interest group or policy group, but in federal law, there is specific provision for minority rights. So now knowing a little bit about redistricting, why is it important? Well, I want to emphasize redistricting is about community representation. And we talk about community interests and communities of interest. And that is sometimes defined by your political boundaries, a city. It is sometimes defined by economic interests, rural areas, agriculture areas, resource extraction. In Washington County, where I live, this is water. Water interests are very important in Washington County for a variety of reasons. That's actually a community interest. It can be economic if you have areas that are predominantly lower income, multifamily housing, affordable housing. Those areas may have different interests than others in your community. So it's a matter about getting communities represented in a way that their voices are heard and their policy interests are served. And so redistricting really determines what voices are heard. If there's imbalance in the districting, there's imbalance in the voices that are heard. And we talk about a term called cracking and packing. That really is getting down to our community or group voices diluted or isolated so that they aren't heard and their interests aren't served. The last thing I want to really emphasize is thinking policy, not party. It's really easy in redistricting to think about party and think about ethnicity. But in party interests and party policy, as we see, can change. And that redistricting in order to align your community with a given party over time may not serve your interests. If you have your community in a district where you have a greater voice in your representative's ear and they have a greater responsiveness to that community will be better served. Their voices will be heard and interests served. So that's why I talk about focusing on policy, not party, because those things change over time. And again, we are a nonpartisan organization, and we're about having community representation and community participation and engagement. This leads us to a term called gerrymandering. And this is named for Governor Elder's Gerry, who in 1812 signed a bill that created a bizarre district around the city of Boston and the Boston area so that they could favor, in particular, the Democratic Republican Party. There were two parties back then, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. And so this was such an odd shaped map that the local newspaper writer said it looked like a salamander, and hence the term gerrymander. We now talk about that in terms of any extreme manipulation of district or legislative boundaries to favor one group over another. It can be racial gerrymandering, it can be partisan gerrymandering, it can be other kinds of interests that are favored to the gerrymandering process. So that's a general term we use. And as I said at the beginning, experience shows that when all of the state government branches, something we call a trifecta, when the House, the Senate, the governor are all controlled by one party, any party and every party has been guilty of gerrymandering. And when I say that, I'm not implying that our elected representatives are somehow dishonest, lack integrity, aren't trying to do the right thing. They absolutely are. And on an individual basis, I've found them to be almost 100% honest and genuine people. On the other hand, parties, when they get together and they have that potential ability to forward what they believe to be a legitimate policy interest and voice and endorsement by the people, they will use that power to potentially unfairly weight their party's interests and representation over the other. So why does it matter? Why is it bad? As I talked about, and one of the things to recognize is manipulated voting maps, even when it's cooperating by both parties, creates safe partisan seats where elected officials represent their political base and not all voters. I'll give a couple of examples here about where this has been bad, but one I'll point out is California. After the 2000 census, the Republicans and the Democrats have consistently for the last several decades dominated the legislature in California. They made an agreement, they call it truce, and basically cooperated on drawing maps in California such that every incumbent, Republican and Democrat, won by at least 20% of the vote. So it created safe partisan seats for both parties, while the Democrats still held the balance of power. Those people representing those districts no longer had accountability to all of their residents. They were accountable to their base. And what happens when you get a base who's driving a selection, the base tends to be more extreme than the population as a whole. And you end up with the legislators, elected representatives being more extreme as a whole than the people that they represent. Gerrymandering, as I said, it creates an unfair distribution of power, doesn't accurately reflect the voters, and it skews the political process where you have maps that are drawn in such a way that the extreme favor one party or the other, where they don't have accountability to the population as a whole. They will tend toward a significantly more conservative or more liberal policies. A couple of examples, this I'll just talk briefly, is congressional gerrymanders in other states. 9th District of Ohio was drawn by Republicans. They put 2 Democrats in the same district, one in Toledo, one in Cleveland, that eliminated one of their districts. This is so close to the lake, the snake by the lake, that they have to monitor lake levels to make sure that it's still contiguous and it's still constitutional. Maryland is a Democratic gerrymander where they split populations of Republicans in order to ensure a Democratic district. This is such a bizarrely shaped district that the constituents don't know who their representative is, and the representative doesn't know who they're representing. So that doesn't help either the represented or the legislators. The Flint water crisis, not many people connect this to gerrymandering, but that's exactly what this is. The Republicans got a gerrymander in 2011 that resulted in a strong bias toward Republican districts. They then used that to pass an emergency manager bill because the Republicans controlled the state government, but they did not control city governments in places like Detroit, Lansing, and Flint. So in order to provide influence and cause there to be change in those governments' actions and policies, they passed an emergency manager bill. Now in Michigan, they had something that said if there was a bill passed by the legislature that did not apportion money, then the voters could have a referendum and reject it. In the 2012 election, the voters did exactly that. 52.7% of the voters rejected the emergency manager bill. And that's about the same proportion as voted for Democratic candidates in the legislature. But what happened was that because of the gerrymandering, the Republicans won 53.6% of the legislative seats. So the Republicans, even though losing on the bill they had, losing the popular vote, still had control of all 3 branches of government. They reissued the emergency manager bill, which an appropriation, which prevented repealing it. And then 2013, the emergency manager signed in Flint. 2014, the emergency manager made a decision to shift the water supply from Detroit City to the Flint River, which resulted in the water crisis with lead poisoning contaminating the water supply of Flint. It was a result of gerrymandering, allowing laws that the people did not want, which caused actions taken to the city of Flint by people who did not represent them and who were not accountable to them. Now, this is a tangible example of why does redistricting matter? Why does government need to be accountable to the people that they're representing, not just the people that voted for them? Closer to home in Minneapolis in 2000, the redistricting in Minneapolis is done by the Charter Commission. And a charter commission tends to not be representative of the community. Now, I don't know if this was gerrymandered intentionally or just happened that way. If you look at the map, the Powderhorn area in Minneapolis is a majority minority area right now. It's majority non-white. The largest ethnic group there is Hispanic. But that was split between 3 different wards in the city council. On the right is the Cedar Riverside area. You may be familiar with that. That is a majority minority district. And it's actually majority Black district, with the major component of that being Somalis. And that was also split, if you look, between 3 different wards, one to the right, one to the left, and one to the south. So as a result, there was a city council not representative of the people of Minneapolis. In 2010, Minneapolis voters approved a change to the city's charter commission that established an advisory commission to the charter commission. They were drawn from citizens of Minneapolis. Now, the league's position is the best way to draw lines is citizen commissions that keep the lawmakers, the elected officials out of the process because they're the ones who benefit from the process. And it also provides opportunity for community input, community voices on how those districts would best represent their needs. And once that was done, there was a much different city council in place. The first Somali American city council representing the area that included the Cedar Riverside area. The first Mexican American council member that represented the area that included the Powderhorn Park area. And then the first Hmong American council member, which represented some of the remainder of South and Western Minneapolis. So that brought an unprecedented degree of racial and ethnic diversity. And while it's difficult and challenging having many different voices, it also ensures that the policies that are created are most representative and most in service of the needs of the community as a whole. So now as you know, why does it matter? How can it impact you in a community and what your representation is? How are those maps drawn? And we talk about this in three terms: the people, the principles, and the process. And I'll credit Nick Harper, who's the League of Women Voters Minnesota Civic Engagement Director, with coming up with that. And if you're from business and I'm from the business world, this is really how any process is set up. You got the people, you have to identify who they are, who make the decisions and take the actions. You have the principles, what rules you have to follow. The end of the process, what steps do you go through? And so any process has those elements, whether they're known or not. In Minnesota, the legislature draws the maps, the governor approves their vetoes. And that's the way it is in 33 states in the United States. Is it's the legislature draws them, the governor approves their vetoes. There's a little bit of variation in that, but that's how that's been done. And traditionally in this country, that's how it's been done. There are 17 states that have different setups. There's 5 states with independent citizen redistricting commissions. And then there's another 12 states that have some variation of political or legislative or advisory commissions. So there are other states with other models. We've got what's traditional. The principles, that's a lot of times that's called criteria. In Minnesota, we have nothing beyond what's required by the federal law and the state constitution. That is equality in population. We cannot dilute racial or ethnic minority voting strength. We have to have convenient, contiguous territories. Beyond that, the law, we don't have any rules to go by in Minnesota. And so what we get is maps that are highly political, that are based on political interest. They don't have what I would call objective criteria that would things, there are things that get considered, but they are at the option and discretion of the legislature. Things like following geographic boundaries, following political boundaries, considering communities of interest, considering compactness, considering competitiveness. So those are things you can consider. From a process standpoint, there's really isn't a legislature, no legal or administrative process to draw maps. And the same applies to cities and counties. It's really up to the elected officials to decide how they want to do that. They are bound by some open meeting laws in the state, but those can be kind of skirted if you work, in pairs, which some counties have done, in order to do some of that background work, have a hearing. That hearing may be perfunctory, and then the maps get approved. So there is the appearance of transparency, but not the reality of transparency. And the other thing I would suggest is there needs to be input from the public, not just presenting to the public. And so we talked about the communities and community interests. Only by listening to and talking to communities can you understand what's important to them. So one of the keys in Minnesota, we don't have a process that we can hold our legislators or our city and county governments accountable to unless they have themselves approved something. This is, again, kind of some of those criteria I talked about, communities of interest, which we think is very important. And frankly, in my and other estimation, this is more important because that is really how we define what we want legislators, elected officials to think about, is what are the communities of interest. Many times that is defined by political boundaries, transportation, infrastructure, public safety, things of that nature many times coincide with political boundaries, cities, counties, but many times it does not. And so then it's a matter of understanding where that variation may occur. The interest of Duluth is not necessarily the same as the rest of St. Louis County. The interests of Rochester are not necessarily the same as the rest of Olmsted County. And there's parts of, for example, North Minneapolis, they may be more aligned with Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center than they are with, for example, South Minneapolis. So it's understanding what those community interests are, and there's multiple interests in understanding what those are. American Indian reservations, that's important to engage those communities and how those maps ought to be drawn to best represent them. And then township boundaries, not favoring a party or candidate. Iowa, I point to frequently as having great requirements. They got defeated in court multiple times on their maps from the 60s and 70s, and they finally put into law very clear, very specific criteria and structure with a nonpartisan advisory commission with a lot of authority to draw their maps. And Iowa does a great job. They haven't taken it away from the legislature entirely, but the legislature has very little authority over how the maps are drawn. So I think that's a pretty good model if you were to ask me Our ideal is an independent commission similar to California, Arizona, Michigan. Let me think of who else. California, Arizona, Michigan are three of the big ones. Virginia just passed it. So, but that, you know, the next best thing is having a really clear criteria and process in law. And competitiveness, competition. And then what I say here is, but since none of this is in statute, if the legislature were to pass maps, from a legal standpoint, we have no grounds to challenge that because there is no criteria in law. And states that have communities of interest as part of commissions or in law, like Montana, there's a place to go to. So given all of that, how have we done in Minnesota? Well, between 1913 and 1959, there was no redistricting of legislative maps in Minnesota. They just didn't do it. And the result was that consider a lot of migration from rural to urban areas, that the vote in a rural area is worth about 10 times more than what a vote in Minneapolis was, because they hadn't redrawn the districts, because the legislators, being primarily from rural areas, they were going to protect the rural interests. And this is not a party thing. This is a, you know, how loud is the voice of the rural areas? And rural areas are very important to say. Agriculture, resource extraction is very important in Minnesota, but it has to be balanced with the rest of the interests. So the legislature didn't draw the lines. Those Supreme Court cases in the early 1960s said, no, you have to have equal voice. And this is a 14th Amendment of the Constitution about equal protection. You had to have equal protection for each person. And if those districts are not of equal or substantially equal population, you don't have that. People's voices aren't given the same weight. Since 1960, though, all but one map, and so that's 11 out of 12, have been rejected or drawn by the courts, because in every one of those instances, we've had divided government. There was agreement reached on the legislative maps in 1971. Congressional map, excuse me. That was the only one. Every other one has been rejected by the courts. In 2000 and 2010, the courts drew the maps because they couldn't even get to the point, they being the governor and the legislature, couldn't even get to the point of agreeing on a map. And because the court draws the maps, I get this question sometimes is, well, why not just let the courts draw the maps? Well, the problem is the courts are going to do the minimum to meet the legal requirements. They're going to have a strong focus on population. They're going to do incremental changes because the courts are there for legal purposes, not for policy purposes. And what that means is they're going to make incremental changes. They do take input, they do have hearings, but it's very limited. And the result is that they're not really stepping back and thinking, not, equally balancing the legal requirements and the policy and public need requirements. And so, conclusion, I want you to take away from this that our current system for redistricting at a state level in Minnesota doesn't work. There's no statute or law for transparency. There's no objective criteria. If we have split government, no one agrees and the courts draw the maps. If one party controls the whole government, which hasn't happened in the last 60 years, but if it does, then it's likely going to be drawn to benefit the governing party. And what we find is when either party thinks they may have control of all three levers, the trifecta, they become less receptive to changing redistricting. So they believe, and I've talked to my own representative, and he believes that he can represent us well and do a good job, and I trust and believe him. But I think when parties get a whole, that is just a lot to expect, that they're going to act in the best interests of the whole and not just of their partisan interest. And history kind of supports that. If you're familiar with Rucho v. Common Cause, partisan gerrymandering finally got decided by the federal courts in 2019. Unfortunately, they said the courts have no voice, have a role in partisan gerrymandering. That may come back, but I think that's going to be a matter of decades before that comes back based on composition of the Supreme Court. So we can't count on the federal courts. I also look at the federal fix as being kind of like hitting a home run in baseball terms. Boy, it's great. And that's like the Supreme Court case that came down on LGBTQ rights under federal voting rights law and federal law and about last summer. And that is a real win. And that helps level the field and reset everything. but I don't think we should count on that. And there's a lot on redistricting. And as I said, redistricting is a lot like elections, is that the authority and the process for that has been at the state level for as long as this country's been around, for 230 years. And so taking that away from the states and trying to overrule the states is a pretty dramatic act, and we shouldn't count on that. So we really need to be working at the state and local level to be involved, take action, have our voice. And for Minnesota, there aren't statements in the Minnesota Constitution, which have been helpful in other states like Pennsylvania and North Carolina, that we are required to have fair and equal elections. In North Carolina and Pennsylvania, that's been language that has enabled them to challenge and overturn partisan maps because it doesn't assure fair and equal elections. So there is some thought about proposing that as a constitutional amendment. Again, that's not something that's going to help us this time around. But again, we can't rely on the Constitution. So if we can't rely on divided government, or if we are relying on divided government, my word is that's like Russian roulette. Divided government only works until you no longer have divided government. Only takes one bad election for one party or the other to have a trifecta to control all the levers and draw the maps as they wish. And since we have no criteria, we have no process requiring public input or scrutiny, then it's going to reflect the partisan needs. And then we're going to turn into California or New Jersey or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or North Carolina. So that's why we need to change in order to prevent that from happening. Local district redistricting briefly. Required by law after legislative maps. Legislative maps, what they do also is define where precinct boundaries are going to be. And that helps define where the maps for county and city level are going to be drawn. And it's required for all counties. And then many cities, Rochester is one of those with wards where you're going to redraw maps. And process requirements are done by the people who draw them. As I said, in Rochester, I look at the charter commission, it's done by the city council. The city charter is done by the city council. Minneapolis is a charter commission. Most cities, it's a city council though. And this is where it falls out, your opportunities for engagement. The Rochester City Council is an opportunity. The Olmsted County Commissioners is an opportunity. Senate and House districts is an opportunity for Rochester. I'll talk about that briefly. And then the congressional districts. And I think my personal opinion, we're likely to lose the 8th congressional seat, but that's kind of like are you going to make the NCAA playoffs? Boy, you really hope you're going to make it, and then you wait for the draw and see what happens. So we'll wait and see what happens on that. But right now, it's very tenuous. From redistricting, and I know I have some the party representation there, but that's just to provide an example because those parties do line up substantially with some policy interests. The Senate district boundary between District 25 and 26 are right through the center of Rochester. I wasn't there, of course, but that may have seemed like a good idea at the time that, okay, we're going to have 2 state senators, both of the same party representing Rochester. Well, over time, because there may have been a focus on policy interests rather than party alignment, affiliation, and support, that may not be working for Rochester because in reality, the interests of rural parts of Olmsted County and those districts are different in many ways than the needs and interests for a policy standpoint of Rochester and the people of Rochester are. And so that voice of Rochester is diluted. It's effectively cracked between 2 Senate districts and somewhat between the House districts. You've got, from a policy standpoint by party, you've got 2 House districts that are very strongly Democratic. And then 1 Republican district is pretty strongly Republican, 1 is very marginally Republican, and 2 very marginal Republican Senate districts. The Republican districts, again, may be getting a lot of input from rural interests, and therefore Rochester may not dominate that conversation or get the representation that it needs if it were all in one district or the other. And then again, it goes back to policy, making sure your policy interests are being heard and being served. And what I'll do now is I'll kick it over to Phil Wheeler, and Phil's going to talk some about the local situation in Rochester, and then we can I'll close out with some words about what next steps and where you can take action.
Okay, well, my name's Phil Wheeler and I've been doing this for a while. I will try to go reasonably quickly through this. Let's see, back up a little bit. So since county redistricting depends on city precincts, we have to start with the cities with wards and precincts, and that's Rochester. As Paul pointed out, we get the local jurisdictions get the block data in the fall. The legislative districts, which we have to follow for precincts at least, we don't get until February 15th. We have, from that point, 2 months, the city does, to do wards and precincts. And then the county has 3 weeks after that to finalize their county commissioner district boundaries. So I'm going to cover why we started at all, and the criteria that Rochester and Olmsted County use, what the process is, and what are our next challenges. So we started in 2012 with a very large imbalance in population between Ward 3, which is green, and Ward 6, which is blue. Keep in mind, in the 2000 census, these were exactly the same. Ward 6 grew by 2,000 people from 11,000 something to 13,880. But Ward 3 more than just about doubled to about 23,000 people. That's called being out of whack, technical term. So Rochester's redistricting criteria were actually adopted, and they said they should balance population, that was required, comply with the Voting Rights Act, make wards compact and contiguous, and protect neighborhood integrity. That was one thing that they felt that the 2002 redistricting had failed to do. I have a map of the, an example of a honeycomb there, because I want to point out that compact and contiguous is something the Supreme Court has said they just have no way of defining, but after all, honeybees have been doing it for 34 million years, so it's got to be possible. There are some corollaries to the redistricting criteria and some implied criteria. One was change as little as possible to minimize confusion. A corollary to the neighborhood integrity issue is following logical boundaries. They wanted to balance the inconvenience as much as possible to the voters. And I think an implied criterion is try to avoid putting incumbents in the same ward. A process was mostly open discussion at the committee of the whole meetings. There was some opportunity for council members to meet with staff to review options. Not many council members took advantage of that opportunity, I have to say. And then the final map and the legal descriptions were adopted by ordinance after public hearings. Here are the 8 finalists, and I realize the map's hard to see on a screen, but I just want to illustrate that redistricting is sort of like squeezing a balloon, in that every time you squeeze a balloon one place, it bulges somewhere else, and every time you shift population from one ward to another, you create a problem somewhere else. So just to show how this worked, for Ward 6, we tried to add population from Ward 3 in various ways. And each time we did that, we did something else to some other ward. One of the options, this is I think option 5, hit on the idea of crossing Highway 52 to pick up the Sunset Terrace area to a large extent, and that was not popular with that incumbent, so we tried different options there. Ultimately, we went back to it, and this is option 8, the final map. Option 8, the maximum deviation from the average population of a ward was less than 1%. And only slightly less than 9,000 people were shifted from one ward to another, and that was the second lowest. So that's the option that we ended up with, and then we drew precinct boundaries and turned it over to the county. Just wanted, before we leave Rochester though, I want to point out that we have a similar problem now, not as bad as it was in 2012. But we don't have the census data yet, but based on the counts of registered voters from the 2020 election, Ward 4 now is low by almost 18%. And Ward 1, which is the brown one, see if that shows up, is high by 13%. So we will have to, I mean, the city of Rochester, not me, will have to revise these districts once again. County followed the redistricting criteria that are in Minnesota statutes. No district, keep in mind, so the Rochester districts came within 0.73% of each other. The state standard for county districts is not more than 10% from the average. And if a district changes by less than 5% of the average of all the districts, the commissioner who's in office gets to serve out the rest of his full term, his or her full term. The other criteria, there were things they had to comply with. The Voting Rights Act, by implication, they wanted to change as little as possible. We were asked to evaluate Rochester's share of seats on the county board, and I think again implied was the notion that we should try to avoid putting incumbents in the same district. We had commissioners take advantage of the opportunity to meet with the staff and the county administrator to review options. There was some discussion at committee of the whole meetings. One of our esteemed county attorneys hired an outside attorney, Alan Weinblatt, to evaluate the options, and that attorney picked the ones that he thought were best met the criteria that were available. And then again, the final map and the legal descriptions were adopted by ordinance after public hearing. Here is where we started in 2002. And again, those by 2012, because of unbalanced growth in the community, those were badly out of whack by about 50%. So one was District 5, which now represented by Jim Beer, was high by 32% almost. And District 2 was low by 19%. So we ended up with several options. The ones that were evaluated by Attorney Weinblatt were option 13. We did 20 or 30 or so. Option 15, option 16, and option 17, going through them fairly fast. But as you can see, the same kind of thing of squeezing balloons in various places to make them even. And here's how they all compared. And these are the criteria that Alan Weinblatt asked us to evaluate them by. How much they deviated from the average, both in absolute terms and by percentage. And the average deviation from the average. The range from the highest to the lowest, the range of minority population, the minority average for the 3 highest seats, the Rochester component, the 5 highest seats, what percentage of those are Rochester dominated seats, the total number of people who moved, and the option that the county board selected had the lowest people moved from one district to another. And then there's a thing called the minimum IPQ, which is the isoparametric quotient. To give you a comparison for a honeycomb, it would be 90%. This is 20%. So that's the option that we ended up with. And here's how we're out of whack again. Districts, I can't actually see the edge of my screen here. District 1 is low by 15%. Districts 2 and 3 are low by about 10%. And 2 districts are fairly high. 4 is this brown district, Matt Flynn's district, and 7 is Mark Tynes' district. Jim Beer's district is within 5% of the new average based on registered voters. And again, this is based on registered voters, not on population, which could change these numbers quite a bit. So here are some challenges that we have coming up for this redistricting. One is that Rochester's population is over 5/7 of the county population. And then the question of how to represent that. And part of that issue also has to do with Rochester's population is about 28% minority, and nearly all of the minority population that is in Olmsted County lives in the city of Rochester. So if this is reflected, we want to make sure, of course, that rural interests are also protected. And then how do we address the packing and cracking issues with both rural and urban and minority interests? One of the things we didn't look at that we probably should is where low-income households are distributed in the effort. And then the final thing, and I think this is where Paul's interest lies, is what is the best possible process that we can follow? And Paul, I think that's me. Back to you. Paul, I'm done. You must be on mute, Paul.
Okay, great. I'm good. All right. Thanks, Phil. No, that was great. What I want to talk about now is, where do we go next? What can you do? How can you learn more? We got the People Power Fair Maps campaign of the League of Women Voters, and that's a 50-state strategy that really got formed after the Rucha v. Common Cause Supreme Court case to focus at the state level, because that's where these decisions are already made and where the action is. So we got 3 real levels and ways of engaging. The first is engaging local communities to influence state and local elected representatives to create maps that reflect needs and interests of their communities. And we talked about the city maps, where there's wards, county maps, legislative maps, congressional maps. So making sure those maps reflect what the needs of the community are. And this involves outreach to the community, involving others in understanding what your communities are and where they are, and then how maps could better be drawn or best be drawn to represent those. One of the things, and I'm working on some graphics to illustrate this, but this is really a bottom-up approach to redistricting versus a top-down. Traditionally, it's been elected leaders, closed room, it's a bunch of data, and then they draw the maps in the way they think is best based on data and based on what they know of their communities, to be fair. But that doesn't always reflect all the voices in the community. And there are communities among us, people among us, who have been historically underheard and underrepresented, and finding ways to help those voices be lifted up. So for me and for the league, this is not necessarily about having the voices of our league members heard. It's of having voices of other members of our community heard. And those folks who may not be getting the representation that would be appropriate based on our democratic principles and based on what would be truly a representative democracy. Also advocating for legislation. We're not dead on legislation this session, but it's a real uphill battle with the other priorities and the split government. But we still want to advocate for legislation. We want to ensure that there's engagement in the hearing process in the legislature on how maps we've drawn, what the public input is, as well as transparency. And finally, we're going to engage in legislative and legal process for drawing maps. There will be hearings at some point, likely in the legislature, on drawing maps. Representative Murphy says they're going to draw maps. I trust Representative Murphy when she says that. And so we want to be ready to have input and comment on how we think those maps ought to be drawn. At the same time, it's highly likely that the courts will weigh in. and that the courts will in the end draw the maps for Minnesota. And we want to be able to have input to that process. And part of our doing that is to work with local committees and communities and feed that to a broader state effort. And we in the league are working with a campaign, the Our Maps Minnesota campaign, with a number of other groups. Many of these have come from our census partnership around the state with other state groups, to leverage that network and that base of people who are interested in having their voices heard through the census and now having their voices heard through redistricting. The why to focus on redistricting, I think I've talked a lot about this. We really think that, first of all, that's important to get communities to have their voices heard, that's where a lot of government actually occurs, is locally. This is an opportunity to engage and act locally. There's only so much people can do in St. Paul in the legislature. And there's much more opportunity with your county commissioners, with your city council, or even with state local legislators, to have them take your message and your voices back to St. Paul. So this is a way to help engage more people and more of the community and get members engaged in a way that may be more gratifying, because there's an opportunity to actually get something done. And you can have local hearings where they are not drowned out by all the other 5.6 million people in Minnesota, that it's only you and your city population or your county. It's also incremental ground level change. So if we think about building a movement for democracy, that we want to focus on community and the people and input of citizens into how our government works by creating that language and that education on what government does. And so this is really an element of civic education, no different than voter service and educating voters on how to vote. This is educating voters and citizens on how our government works and how they can ensure a government is representing them. So you can look at this as a part of your civic education, both for your league, because I know I didn't know a lot about what my county commissioners did until I looked at what's in the county budget and why should I care about county redistricting. So there's an opportunity to help leverage this effort for other ends, both growing your network locally by recruiting and mobilizing members, and by educating people about what their government does and what it could and should be doing. My advice to you on how to engage in city and council redistricting is to start early. While they're not going to actually draw maps until a year from now, there's an opportunity to engage, educate, mobilize between now and then. Respect the elected officials that they want to represent you. They want to hear from you. They may not know you care, and they may not know what some of the other options are. And so it's an opportunity to let them know what you think some of those other opportunities may be. With consider having an advisory commission, consider establishing criteria, consider creating a way for citizen groups to provide input, provide maps, suggested maps to the city council or the county commissioners on how the maps ought to look for consideration. And they may not have started thinking about this, but this is an opportunity to have folks start thinking about these terms. And I can provide you some examples of what some other places have done. Attend those county commission and county council meetings. This is something the league is really good at, knowing who those governmental bodies are, when and where, and how do they meet? How do you get in front of them? And so you can do that, and you can help others do that by providing them the knowledge and the structure to assist that. And then local letters to the editor. If you're fortunate enough to have a paper in your local community, this is an opportunity to do that. Some options for engagement. And one of my things is I don't see this as a one size fits all. I see this as a menu. This is an a la carte menu, and it's a matter of allowing local leagues, individuals, and other groups to engage in those aspects of redistricting that most interest them in a way and to a degree that works for them. A local league like Rochester may have many other issues that it's concerned about and has its priorities. There may be a subset of members who are very interested in redistricting, and I'm more than willing to work with that group. There may be one person who's really interested in mapping, and I'm happy to provide an opportunity to that. There's ways to get training, get involved, especially in this wonderful virtual world we have of Zoom, to be engaged in meetings with people all over the state, using online tools to help them be effective and have their community voices heard. So again, you can operate at kind of a general postcard letter campaign. That worked really well last year. We're going to do that again. advocate for legislation, become part of the lobby corps. You can get involved with state maps, have inputs, help local groups draw their communities of interest, map those out, engage in local maps, city council, county commissioners, and then working with groups that census partners on how to do this. So a lot of different ways to get involved. Pick one that works for you to a level or degree that works for you. If it's an hour a week, great. If it's more than that, great. I'm effectively a full-time volunteer with the League of Women Voters, and that's my choice, but I don't advocate for anybody else to do that, but that's just a choice that I made. So I want to give everybody else a choice in deciding how, where, when you will engage in this, if that's your desire. So for League of Women Voters Rochester or other groups here, consider forming a local redistricting team to learn more and review options. We've only kind of touched the tip of the iceberg on this, and there's a lot more detail, but I really want you out of this to understand what is redistricting, why is it important, what's going to happen and when, what's the timeline, and then what are your next steps? Where might you get involved? How might you make a difference? You can have your local board or your advocacy team meet and talk about what works for you. If you individually want to do something, let me know. My email is there, phuffman@lwvmn.org. You can go to League of Women Voters Minnesota website under staff. I'm listed there as well. Or let anybody from the Rochester League know, and they can reach out to me as well. Ray Schmitz is our point of contact for the People Power Fair Maps campaign with the Rochester League, and Ray can connect you with me if that's what you want to do. So again, I thank you for this opportunity to talk to you tonight. I hope I haven't put too many of you to sleep with all this information. I'm happy to talk outside of this, however and whenever and however long it would work for you. So thanks, Ray. I appreciate your time, and I'll turn it back over to you for questions.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Phil. Reminder, as you said, this is pretty dense, but it's all been recorded, and you can look on the League of Women Voters Rochester website to review it. Let me do a little housekeeping. A reminder to please complete the League of Women Voters poll at the end of the session. I want to introduce briefly some elected officials who've been with us this evening. School Board Member Karen McLaughlin from District 535, City Council Person Kelly Ray Kirkpatrick from Rochester, Rochester Mayor Kim Norton, Liz Bolden from District 25, Commissioner Stephanie Padelke from the Olmsted County Board, and Mayor Tyrell Clark. And for Karen, I have a trivia question, and then we'll get to our questions. Where does one person, one vote come from in Olmsted County? Since you can't answer, I have to do that. In the middle of the last century, a county board chair by the name of Richard Towie found himself at the Supreme Court. They had been contacted about the county board redistricting, and they raised the issue of one person, one vote based on the US Supreme Court decision. And the Minnesota Supreme Court said, Mr. Towie, your redistricting plan doesn't give equal weight to everybody, change it. So that's where Olmsted County has one person, one vote ever since. Okay, first question, should competitive districts be a goal since they aren't dominated by one or another party?
Yeah, and I can answer that, Ray, competitive district.
You had, Paul, yes, I believe you had.
Yeah, I put that in the chat, but just for everybody's benefit. Yeah, competitiveness is one of the criteria that's frequently used. And there was another question about vote efficiency gap. That is one way of measuring competitiveness. What's important is agreeing on how to measure it and where it fits into priorities. Frequently, what you do is you look at the list of criteria, you rank those. Always at the top are those things that are legally required, like equality population, minority representation, convenient and contiguous districts. So those things are at the top of the list always. And it was interesting, my home county in 2011 put one of those further down in the list, and I kind of asked them about that. but then from there, you kind of decide what the priorities are. Competitiveness may be a lower priority than, for example, communities of interest and compactness, but it's still a priority. And that priority is important because it's going to determine what trade-offs you make. And Nick and I were talking today about redistricting and this order for our alliance. And we may give up a little bit in compactness to get a big gain in communities of interest. So compactness may be higher than communities of interest, but it's always about what's the magnitude of the change. Competitiveness will probably be a little further down, because in order to achieve communities of interest and compactness, we're probably going to have to give up something in competitiveness. So yes, it's a criteria, but there's always a lot of the debate is in what order do those take and what you put over what else.
I'm reminded that there's another council person in attendance, Patrick Keene from the Rochester City Council. Question number 2, and I think you've talked about this too, Paul. Beyond 2022, how can we advocate to move the Minnesota redistricting process away from the legislature? And you talked about Iowa, but go ahead briefly.
Yeah, no, and thanks, Ray. Yeah, and in my view, and I take a real long view on these things, there's a what we can do now and there's a what we can do in the long term. And the legislative activity now and the work we do at the local level now both help set the stage and build momentum for later change. I fully expect that the legislature is not going to make significant progress on this. Our objective in our alliance in the League of Women Voters is to use a citizen parallel commission inputting to the Supreme Court to model what we think is the best interest of voters in Minnesota for how to do redistricting, and then carry that forward to the legislative session 2022 as a proposal for legislation on how we change the approach to redistricting. Because as I say, we just don't think it works. This will be another opportunity to show why it doesn't work because of the partisan, inherently political partisan nature of it. And then we'll continue to advocate for this in subsequent legislative session, just continue to emphasize how that is a better and prove it's a better approach.
Again, you've kind of talked about this, but obviously, you know, people are a lot is going by fast this evening. What happens when the courts reject the maps that are proposed by the legislature?
Great question. One of two things happens. Either the court rejects and sends it back to the legislature and the governor and generally it's the legislature, in order to redraw the maps, addressing whatever defect the court has identified. That's what generally happens. What happens in that case has happened, it's been 1990 since that happened. What will happen is if the legislature just deadlocks and can't do it, then the court will draw the map. What they do in that case, though, is they start with what the legislature provided and then adjust that to make it legal. Again, that's similar to what happened in 2001 and 2011, where the court took the existing maps because the legislature and the governor couldn't agree and just adjusted them and made them legal, basically equalized population and a few other things. But it's an incremental change. So that's when the court rejects it, they do give an opportunity for the legislature to fix it. But if they can't, then the court will do incremental adjustments to make it legal.
Paul, I don't think you touched on this, the so-called efficiency gap.
Right.
Could that be used to measure the fairness of a district?
Yeah, that's a great question. That is actually because for years, the way people have been trying to approach, well, the Supreme Court, when Justice Kennedy was on, said they were receptive. And Justice Kennedy said he was receptive to listening to arguments on partisan gerrymandering, but he needed to have something as what is the solution that they would have the courts provide. Efficiency gap became the statistical method of saying, basically you look at if you have a competitive district, there are no wasted votes, every vote counts. And the degree to which votes are wasted, in other words, people in a district say, yeah, it doesn't matter if I vote or not because the outcome is predetermined by the partisan bias of my district. So you measure that. And if you get Wisconsin, I want to say has an efficiency gap of like 15% because it is so heavily gerrymandered. You get 53% of the votes overall going to Democrats in the legislature, but 60% of the House seats and 60% of House seats go to Republicans. So there's a pretty heavy bias. So you could measure the number of wasted votes, and what you do is you try to minimize the number of wasted votes or vote efficiency. That is a part of competitiveness. And so once people brought forward the idea of efficiency gap as a statistical approach to rule on partisan gerrymandering, the court punted and said it's not our problem.
Actually, the Supreme Court
Bill, go ahead.
Chief Justice claimed that the efficiency gap was sociological gobbledygook. I think that was his term.
Yeah,
John
he did.
Roberts.
Well, yeah.
I like these classy statements from our Supreme Court Chief Justice. If there is anybody who has a totally pressing question, we've got a minute or so. Hurry quick.
I do notice that I saw something from Red Wing in there. Hey, Red Wing, you guys have wards, so you got to do redistricting as well. So give me a yell if I can help.
Yeah, Peggy Decker is attending from Red Wing apparently.
Great.
Okay, thank you, Paul and Phil, for a marvelous presentation tonight. As I indicated, all of this is going to be recorded and available on the League of Women Voters website. Reminder to complete the poll as you're signing off. It only takes a moment. Thank you to the League of Women Voters for organizing this presentation. A reminder that this fall, there will be another presentation on redistricting in the city of Rochester, and Olmsted County will be closer to the ground then, in the sense that we will have more information from the census and from what happens. For example, one of the big things that will be happening, which we didn't even touch on, is the fact that Minnesota may lose a congressional district. So we could end up having the current 8 districts reduced to 7 districts. Hopefully not. Hopefully we got enough people in the census, but if that happens, it adds a great deal of political chaos to what then will be happening at the legislature. So thank everyone for your attendance. Thank you for your good questions, and we'll sign off. Good evening.